Mm.
It is kind of a story. I took the book. That's for the defense. That's Henry. Over there, I see us. Who will be happy? He is a happy man today because today he's going out. And if he gets him, he has in this month's tomorrow. And a fool. Right off the month. Now in order to win, on his back. So he's counting pushing. Yes. Let's get it out. However, these feelings are not about that. He's pushing my favorite. They're justice. And justice is as an elite person finding truth. And what is it? One, that girl is wait. That is true. That's the process. Not that one. And evidence. Other than the testimony of the victim. Something is that my client,
Here Comes the Sun has become one of the most popular and treasured Beatles songs, a gateway into their music for many new fans. This 3-minute gem of unforgettable songwriting is also packed intriguing anomaly, production works, and even a mystery. I'm going to take you on a journey through the song's creation and point out some of these surprises. As a fair warning, you can't unhear this. Here Comes the Sun kicks off the second half of the Beatles' iconic Abbey Road album, released in September 1969, the last studio album they recorded before splitting up in 1970. Unlike the vast majority of Beatles songs, Here Comes the Sun was not written by the main songwriting duo of Paul McCartney and John Lennon, but rather by George Harrison, the youngest member of the quartet, who contributed 2 memorable pieces to the Abbey Road album, an endearing love song called Sunrise, and the effervescent Here Comes the Sun. According to his later account, George composed the song in Eric Clapton's country estate, apparently skipping a stressful business meeting to instead bask in the pleasure of a beautiful spring day. With an acoustic guitar in hand, George translated his experience into the blissful tune we know today. The actual recording of Here began on July 7, 1969, 1 week into the sessions for the future Abbey Road album. 13 takes of the basic rhythm track were committed to tape, with Paul McCartney contributing a tasteful bass guitar part, Ringo Starr delivering a dazzling, intricate performance performance on drums. And George handling the main sections on acoustic guitar. The only Beatle not present was John Lennon, who was recovering from a recent car accident in Scotland. After 13 takes, the band decided that the last one was the best of the bunch. On the next day, July 8th, George recorded fresh lead vocals, replacing the guide track from the previous day's session.
Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. I say it's alright. Here comes. Here comes.
One of these harmonized sections might sound familiar. It was likely inspired by a song called I Live Used, originally by the Sundays, which became a hit in the UK in 1968 and covered by a group called Vanity Fair. While the main elements of the song were now in place, it was far from finished. A week later, on July 16th, George added a few more textures, including a harmonium and some hand claps. After a brief hiatus, production picked up again in early August. On the 6th and the 11th, George experimented with adding electric guitar, some of which survived as a final mix, and some didn't. On the parts that survived, George used a creative technique to transform the sound of his electric guitar into something almost unrecognizable. Instead of playing through a normal guitar amplifier, George used a special speaker with a rotating chamber called Leslie, more commonly paired with an organ, as heard in many jazz and rock recordings of the era. You can hear George's unique Leslie guitar at various points, but it's most clear during a brief snippet at around 1:15. Interestingly, before recording Here Comes the Sun, George had experimented with this technique on a song called Badge, written with his friend Eric Clapton for the band Cream. George even noted on the lyric sheet to Here Comes the Sun that this part was the, quote, son of Badge. A different electric guitar part from these August sessions didn't make it. In 2011, this intriguing lost overdub was rediscovered during the filming of a documentary about life. George ultimately felt the guitar solo didn't really fit and instructed the EMI engineers to leave it out of the final mix. A few days after the electric guitar overdubs, George turned to a special ingredient that had enhanced many other Beatles songs, an orchestral arrangement. As usual, the band's multi-talented producer, George Martin, quickly whipped together a beautiful arrangement for a string and woodwind ensemble that was recorded by session musicians at EMI on August 15th. Still, this was not enough for the so-called Quiet Beatle. With just days to go before the album was set to be mixed, George felt this song needed one final ingredient: the fabulous and otherworldly sounds created by a new electronic instrument called the Moog. Invented by engineer Robert, this groundbreaking device was the first commercially available modular synth, and it had made cameo appearances on recent albums such as Strange Days by The Doors, Bookends by Simon & Garfunkel. George had first witnessed the Moog's capabilities while producing Apple artist Jackie Lomax's debut album in Los Angeles the year before. George soon ordered a custom-built beat for himself, one of the first to be delivered to the UK. Clearly enamored with the Moog's capabilities, George released an entire album filled with its sounds in early 1969 on the Beatles' short-lived experimental label Zappa. For the Abbey Road sessions, George enlisted Beatles road manager Mal Evans to transport the hefty Moog from George's home to EMI Studios. Bert was set up for recording. George apparently received little guidance on how it actually worked. Nonetheless, the results of his tinkering are, in my view, sublime. The other Beatles were fascinated by the Moog too, though it augmented a handful of other Abbey Road tracks, including Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and Because. There's another little production-related work done in Moog in Here Comes. According to the Abbey Road Super Deluxe Edition booklet, the Moog part was recorded onto the same track that contained the Warnings book, August 15th, erasing those entirely. Well, almost. One tiny section that survived, and it can be heard briefly after the bridge part. Oh, isn't late. All the pieces finally placed on the packed 8-track tape. A beautifully layered recording of Here Comes the Sun was finally ready to be mixed, where, of course, the anomalies continued. If you have perfect pitch, or have tried to play along to the recording, you might have noticed that the key of the song is slightly sharp. For comparison, here's the original. And here's the final version. This intentional adjustment, often called bare speed, was occasionally used by the Beatles to lend a special texture to their studio recordings. Another post-production work in Here Comes the Sun was discovered much later. In most of the choruses, George adds, and I say, following the second line. But in the last chorus, George skipped it. So we thought until 2006, when Here Comes the Sun was remixed for the Cirque du Soleil musical, Love. In that version, the missing line was restored and heard by fans for the very first time. The last piece of Here Comes the Sun post-production trivia is a bittersweet one. The date that the song was mixed, August 20th, 1969, marked the last time that all four Beatles, Paul, John, George, and Ringo, were together in the studios of EMI. The end of an unparalleled 7-year creative journey in those hallowed halls. One of their tasks on that last day together was to determine the order of songs on the album. They ultimately decided to place Here Comes the Sun as the opener of the second half of the album. A brilliant segue following one of the most intense songs in their catalog, I Want You, She's So Heavy, which ends abruptly during a swelling wave of multi-track guitars and electronic notes. Record over, or nowadays just wait for a few seconds. And Here Comes the Sun, resetting the tone for the rest of side 2, leading into the joyful Abbey Road medley. There's a little surprise in the sequencing too, perhaps coincidental. Both sides of Abbey Road open with the same two vocals. But that's not all. The same thing happens again 3 songs later during one of John Lennon's contributions to There's a bit of a mystery as to which one was written. This suggests that John might have actually inspired George long before the Abbey Road sessions began. The theory is based on a tape recorded in the Get Back sessions in January 1969, when John wrote the riff, what would later become the opening of the Sun King. While messing around, allegedly he sings Here Comes the Sun. After the low quality of the recording, it's very tough to make out what John's singing here, and I have found many other support members. Furthermore, he never repeats this phrasing, despite returning to the riff numerous times from the Get Back sessions. So I don't find this theory particularly convincing. Another theory, which I find more plausible, is that John's opening lyrics in Sun King were written after George's song as a deliberate callback, combined with some typical cheeky Lennon wordplay referencing the actual song came included in the tape. They don't know when John wrote the lyrics, but we do know that some game was recorded a few weeks after Here Comes the Sun. Adding to the confusion are a couple of entries in the Beatles' newsletter from that summer where the two songs are referred to under a single title. It's also labeled this way on the tape files. Neither John nor George ever spoke on a connection, so we may never know the true version story. The connection wouldn't be surprising, but sharing and emulating ideas within the group was part of the Beatles' formula all along. You can even trace a thematic line from Here Comes the Sun back to Good Day Sunshine on Revolver. Or even earlier, on I'll Follow the Sun, in which George played another lovely finger pick for company. Origin stories aside, the impact of Here Comes the Sun cannot be overstated. Along with its Harrison counterpart on Abbey Road or Something, Here Comes the Sun marked a major turning point in George's recognition as a songwriter. Producer George Martin later commented that it was the first time that George had really come through with a brilliant composition. John and Paul were equally impressed and praised the song in many later interviews. Despite the collective admiration, Here Comes the Sun wasn't chosen by the band as a promotional single in the US or the UK. Early public reactions were not unanimously positive either. The New York Times review called George's contributions to Abbey Road mediocrity incarnate.
All these allegations.
Any criticism was pretty short-lived, and George's prowess as an independent songwriter would be confirmed the following year with his universally acclaimed triple album, All Things Must Pass. Indeed, the passage of time has been kind to Here Comes. George performed it live on a handful of occasions, including at his 1971 concert for Bangladesh, in 1976 in a gorgeous duet with another musically inclined Paul Simon on the American late-night TV show Saturday Night Live. And then, of course, there's the Eric Idle version. George released a sequel of sorts called Here Comes the Moon, on his self-titled album in 1979. Speaking of outer space, Carl Sagan lobbied for Here Comes the Sun to be included among other celebrations of human achievement on the famous gold disc aboard the exploratory spacecraft Voyager 1, but unfortunately permission couldn't be secured at the time. A different remarkable upward journey would await Here Comes the Sun decades later, rocketing to the top of digital music platforms in recent years as the most streamed Beatles song ever, and by a considerable margin. It's a bit ironic that a George Harrison song, rather than a Lennon McCartney hit, has become the gateway into the Beatles for new generations of fans. It's not hard to understand why. It contains the raw ingredients of so many of their hits: irresistible songwriting, compelling performances, and innovative studio techniques. George's experimentation with the Moog synthesizer was yet another step in the band's long history of introducing eclectic instruments into their music, from the sitar on Norwegian Wood to the mellotron. To make its masterful production, the message of Here Comes the Sun is timeless and universal. George wrote this anthem of optimism during a harrowing period in his life, surrounded by seemingly insurmountable personal and professional challenges. But no matter how long, cold, or lonely the winter may seem, we have to remind ourselves, like George, that the sun will come again, and it's alright. Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to support my channel further, consider becoming a YouTube member to get access to some special perks. And as always, thanks for watching.
Go ahead, Paul.
In the coastal sector, the Union was also achieving big victories. Starting in February, the Union Navy started a concentrated campaign to take key strategic points along the Confederate coastline. In North Carolina, over the course of 10 weeks, they took control over every port except for Wilmington. Next, they took Fort Pulaski downriver from Savannah in April. And in November of 1861, the Union Navy had taken the Port Royal Sound, which was 50 miles south of Charleston. By summer of 1862, the Federal Navy controlled virtually all of the Atlantic coastline, from Savannah to Norfolk. Victories were permanent. In the major peaks, Savannah, Wilmington, etc., was a suicide mission. However, the Union Navy countered that by taking enough key points around those port cities. Their warships could then use those locations as bases to launch blockade operations. Federal warships could then keep an eye out for any blockade-running vessels that dared to leave the major ports of the Confederacy. At the start of the war in 1860, the Union Navy wasted critical time and resources sailing from northern ports to their blockade locations. The key victories of 1862 changed the dynamics of the Union blockade and helped to significantly cut down on the rebel blockade runners. In the central sector were more victories. In Kentucky, Unionists had gained strong control over the state from secessionists. From a military perspective, in February of 1862, Union forces won the battle at Mill Spring. Its victory, combined with the Battle of Middle Creek, was won in January, solidified Union control over much of the state of Kentucky. Ewell was to next use the Army of Ohio on a strike to take the critical Confederate rail center of Chattanooga. Taking that rail center gave backbreaker Southern logistics and would accomplish Lincoln's cherished goal of liberating East Tennessee. The losses in 1862 would steadily force the Confederates to change their strategy. After the victory at Bull Run, Confederate war strategy flaws became apparent. The strategy of defending every point around the South's massive perimeter was just unworkable. By spreading out and trying to deny all Union invasions, left the Confederates weak and overextended. As well, Union victory rebels wanted to deter the Union forces from simply trying again. That was because defensive battles did not disabling damage on the North, nor did it open the prospect of any new strategic initiative. Over the first half of 1862, it became clear that the Union was capable of hitting the South at any point it wanted, while if the Confederates tried to respond to every one of those threats, they would be overstretched to a breaking point. If you try to be strong everywhere, you'll end up being weak everywhere. That is why Jefferson Davis and the Confederate military leadership shifted their strategic focus to the offensive-defensive approach. Places in areas of secondary importance at the outer edges, like their many coastal ports, were not to be defended anymore. Scattered forces were to be regrouped and pulled inland in order to operate on the South's superior line, moving by railroad to confront the major Northern armies as they appeared. One effect of this change would be the virtual abandonment of the southwestern sector. Another effect would be to provide the Confederate Army in Virginia a larger striking force, which could be used to mount an offensive into northern territory, if that opportunity presented itself, of course. That opportunity would present itself in the summer and fall of 1862. But before we go into Lee's invasion, let's dive into the sector I haven't covered yet. In the Spring and early summer of 1860, General McClellan's Army of the Potomac would embark on an offensive to keep the momentum of the Union's successes going. Their ultimate goal was to seize the Confederate capital of Richmond and end the war. McClellan took over a broken and disorganized Union army in Washington after Bull Run, then set about turning it into a professional army rather than a collection of amateurs. McClellan was an excellent organizer. He quickly set to work turning Union regiments into brigades, brigades into divisions, and divisions into corps. He then gave those corps corps commanders. The pre-war American Army had been so small that corps and divisions did not even exist, and brigades were just coming into being. In fact, McDowell and McClellan were the only pre-war American generals who had been sent to Europe to see how large armies conducted themselves. The vast majority of American Civil War generals were learning on the fly. As McClellan looked to professionalize this largely amateur army, uniforms and weapons were given some measure of standardization, discipline and drill were properly imposed, and finally, he gave this army a name, the Army of the Potomac. McClellan's efforts paid massive dividends. Morale and pride within this army soared after he took over. McClellan's personal touch and deep care for the men under his command led them to feel strongly devoted to their commander. They fully believed in him. At first, in the North, Lincoln, the press, and the politicians all shared this belief in McClellan. He was touted to be the savior of the Union, and given the nickname Little Napoleon. However, as 1861 turned into 1862, and the Army of the Potomac showed no signs of moving on the Army of Northern Virginia, Lincoln and his cabinet started to grow restless. McClellan was a perfectionist, obsessed with refining all the little technical details before launching an offensive. He always worried that he never had enough of everything, whether it was men or equipment, and likewise that the enemy was significantly more powerful than the force that he had at his disposal. In late 1861, McClellan came up with his first plan for an invasion of Virginia. He dismissed the idea of assaulting the Confederate forces head-on at Manassas Junction, like McDowell had been forced to do. Instead, McClellan wanted a bold joint Army-Navy landing operation that would unload the Federal forces at Urbana on the Rappahannock River in Virginia. From there, his forces would march to Richmond, which was only 50 miles away from Urbana. By January of 1860, McClellan changed his mind. He would wait on Buell's army to advance to Kentucky before he did anything in Virginia. McClellan even considered moving his army to Kentucky and abandoning all notion of invading Virginia. All of this made Lincoln grow frustrated at McClellan's delays and lack of movement. He ordered McClellan south to confront the Confederates at once. McClellan hated this. He felt that Lincoln was meddling in military affairs that he, as a lawyer and politician by trade, didn't really understand. McClellan responded by resurrecting his Urbana plan. If the Army of the Potomac landed at Urbana, it could outflank the Confederate forces at Manassas, forcing that army south to cover Richmond and Norfolk. The Union advance could be supported logistically by supplies brought in from the sea. By March 8th, McClellan and his Grand Army still had not moved, and so Lincoln called him to the White House for an explanation. On March 10th, McClellan's forces finally began to move out. To McClellan's surprise, though, the Confederate Army at Manassas had retreated back behind the Rappahannock River, which ruined his planned Urbana route. The next day, McClellan was relieved from his post as General-in-Chief. Instead, Lincoln wanted him to focus solely on the Virginia theater. McClellan was furious at this demotion, but it did have the intended effect, relieving McClellan of the slows. McClellan laid out a new plan of attack. He still wanted to avoid the direct path to the Confederate Army through Manassas, but instead of landing at Urbana, McClellan would land his army at the tip of the James River Peninsula at Fort Monroe. He would post a 120,000 men of the Army of the Potomac onto transports, then, utilizing the protection of the Federal Navy, sailed them into Chesapeake Bay, into the strategic cover provided by Fortress Monroe. Once landed, his army would advance directly to Richmond. Besiege it before Joe Johnston's army, which was on the Rappahannock, knew what was happening. In McClellan's mind, this plan had all the proper advantages. By using Federal sea power, it would overcome the Confederate advantages of using the interior lines in Virginia by constituting a gigantic turning movement that would force the Confederates to abandon everything north of Richmond without a shot. This plan with the rebel capital and not the rebel army as the primary objective. Lincoln, who had been reading military science books to kind of give himself a crash course on military affairs, this approach didn't make sense. He thought that the only way to cripple the Confederacy and win the war would be by destroying the main rebel army. McClellan's plan also worried Secretary of War Stanton. He felt that it left Washington open to attack from the Confederate force in Virginia. Lincoln ultimately approved the plan. However, he had McClellan leave roughly 30,000 under McDowell to protect Washington. McClellan still had 90,000 to the campaign. However, in his mind, this was a critical error by Lincoln. The number of rebels facing McClellan's army would steadily grow in the Union commander's mind as the campaign wore on. From March 24th until April 4th, the Army of the Potomac massed on the James Peninsula. And true to McClellan's prediction, the Confederate Army in Virginia was caught totally by surprise. Only a single force of 15,000 rebel infantry stood in McClellan's way on a drive to Richmond. This McClellan decisively, he could push past his force at Yorktown with ease. However, the Confederate commander there, John McGruber, successfully bluffed McClellan into thinking the Confederate force in the past was much larger than it actually was. McClellan moved on Yorktown slowly, cautiously. By the time McClellan was ready to open up a major assault on the Yorktown line on May 5th, Johnston's Confederate army in Virginia had been regrouped around Richmond and prepared to give McClellan the type of defensive battle that he had hoped to avoid by outflanking them. Over the next 3 weeks, McClellan slowly inched his way up the peninsula, growing more and more convinced that Johnston had as many as 200,000 rebels defending Richmond. Johnston actually only had about 60,000. McClellan sent a request to Lincoln for more reinforcements, starting with McDowell's troops. He wanted that Union force to march south across the Rappahannock and join him around Richmond. By the last half of May, McClellan and the Army of the Potomac were by the Chickahominy River, 6 miles from Richmond, with his right flank sitting to the northwest, and expecting to be joined by McDowell there. McClellan was building up to his eventual assault on Richmond by slowly advancing his army, corps by corps, across the Chickahominy. Bad luck then struck. A brutal storm came through, which blew out the bridges on that river. Left 2 of McClellan's 5 corps isolated on the other side of the Chickahominy. On May 31st, Johnston looked to strike at these isolated corps, wheeling his entire army into position to attack. This was the Battle of Seven Pines. For 2 days, the Confederate forces pounded away at the 2 vulnerable Union corps. However, they would not be broken. The Confederates were forced to withdraw. Seven Pines had large ramifications. For one, the aggressive strike by the rebels caused McClellan to become even more cautious in his offensive, slowing his advance across the Chickahominy. The other, and more important one, was that Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army in Virginia, due to Johnston being wounded in that battle. Lee was the epitome of an aggressive general, never afraid to take bold gambles if it could lead to a grand victory. Lee was excellent at shifting his forces on the battlefield in order to gain the upper hand in any attack or to save a threatened sector. Lee had actually already provided trouble for the Army of the Potomac. In March, Lee had convinced Jefferson Davis to allow Stonewall Jackson, the hero of Bull Run, take command of a small Confederate army in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and make a threatening feint towards Harper's Ferry in the lightly defended Union capital. Jackson then moved menacingly towards D.C., confirming all of Lincoln and Stanton's fears that McClellan's campaign had left the capital too exposed. Lincoln would then throw 3 separate federal forces of about 40,000 to track down Jackson's 16,000. Jackson easily eluded or defeated all 3 and left all of the federal troops in northern Virginia bewildered, unavailable, increasingly nervous McClellan. That force of federal troops held up by Jackson's feint included McDowell's troops. Lee, now in command, wasted no time getting on the offensive. Starting on June 25th, began what became known as the 7 Days Battle. Finding the federal forces still straddling the Chickahominy, Lee decided to strike at the forces on the north side of that river at Mechanicsville. Lee's attacks were repulsed, but he was unbothered and attacked again the next day at Gaines Mill, forcing the Union troops to withdraw. McClellan at this point had become overwhelmed with word that he was surrounded and vastly outnumbered by rebel forces. He concluded that he had no choice but to fall back to a safe spot on the James River near Harrison's Landing. Lee, sensing blood, pursued them vigorously, hitting them at Allen's Farm and Savage's Station on June 29th, and then again at Glendale and White Oak Swamp on June 30th. Finally, Lee was handed a bloody repulse, July 1st at Malvern Hill. In all, the 7 Days Battle cost Lee's army over 3,400 killed and over 15,000 wounded. However, Richmond had been saved. More importantly, the Army of the Potomac was bottled up and dug in near the James River. This gave the Confederate Army opportunity to utilize the offensive part of their offensive-defensive strategy. Lee would now embark on a bold strike to the north, carry the war for the first time into Union territory. In the wake of the 7 Days Battle, the Army of the Potomac was in disarray. McClellan blamed the leaders in Washington for his defeat. In particular, he felt that Secretary of War Stanton had not given him adequate troop strength. McClellan claimed that throughout the campaign, he was outnumbered by the Confederate forces facing him, which wasn't exactly true. Due to the Peninsula campaign's failure, Lincoln once again looked to make adjustments. On June 17th, he had summoned General John Pope from the west to take command of the newly designated Army of Virginia. This army was formed out of the units who had failed to catch Stonewall Jackson. This new army would not be under McClellan's command, though. Deeply angered the Union general that once again Lincoln seemed to be taking away his power. The fact that that army was under the command of Pope was even worse. McClellan and Pope held each other equally in disdain, which would make their working relationship complicated, to say the least. The other move Lincoln made was to bring Halleck to Washington to appoint him General-in-Chief on July 23rd. That was the same position McClellan had held 4 months ago. Over the course of July, things did not get much better, as McClellan continued to ask for more and more reinforcements in order to resume the offensive on Richmond. The final nail in the coffin of the campaign came after Halleck visited McClellan. McClellan claimed that with 30,000 more reinforcements, he could take Richmond. Halleck responded that only 20,000 were available. He continued to say if 20,000 wasn't enough, they would have to withdraw the armies of the Potomac from the peninsula. This prospect alarmed McClellan, because it would confirm his campaign as a failure. He agreed to the 20,000 reinforcement number. However, after Halleck arrived back in Washington, McClellan then asked for 60,000 reinforcements. That was the final straw. Halleck responded by ordering McClellan to transfer his army to northern Virginia in order to reinforce Pope. Halleck then went on to use McClellan's own exaggerations against him. He stated that if Lee really did have 200,000 men holding the position between Pope's 40,000 and McClellan's 90,000, the Confederates could use their interior lines Pope's army in the Battle of Cedar Mountain. McClellan reacted to this news with satisfaction. He hoped that after Pope was embarrassed by the rebel forces, that Lincoln and his administration would be forced to turn over control of the war effort back to him. That is why McClellan was in no hurry to reinforce Pope. On August 3rd, McClellan had received his orders to reinforce Pope. However, the first units of his did not leave until August 14th. The last troops finally embarked Fortress Monroe on September 3rd, actually. Lee and Jackson, meanwhile, continued their advance. Leaving 22,000 men to defend Richmond, Lee sent the rest of the Confederate forces to reinforce Jackson for an attack on Pope before McClellan's men joined his army. The strength of Lee's army heading north, roughly 55,000 at this point, and they were chasing Pope's army of about roughly equal size. Pope responded by pulling back north of the Rappahannock. Lee then made a bold move. He split his army and sent Jackson with half of it on a wide flanking move around Pope's right and rear to sever his supply line. Jackson's men managed to log 50 miles in their 2-day march to outflank Pope's army. Jackson's men were now at Manassas Junction, 20 miles to Pope's rear. Pope responded to this threat to both sides of his army by trying to push north to destroy Jackson's army before it could be united with Lee's. On August 28th, Pope's forces made contact with Jackson, west of Manassas Junction. On that day, a vicious firefight broke out as neither side gave an inch by dark. The Federal forces and Pope combined in front of Jackson's front. Pope believed that Jackson was going to retreat, join Longstreet's men. However, in actuality, the rebels planned on the opposite. Longstreet was moving forward with Jackson. On August 29th, he rolled his army piecemeal against the strong Confederate position. Pope managed to only get 32,000 of his men in action against Jackson's 22,000. By August 30th, Lee was on the field. First action was to pull back some of the forces to realign them for a flanking move around Pope. Pope misinterpreted this as an enemy retreat. He was completely unaware that Longstreet had moved forward and joined Jackson's right flank. That is why on August 30th, Pope had his force launch a full-scale frontal assault on Jackson's half of the Army of Northern Virginia. They were fully engaged. Longstreet counterattacked against Pope's virtually undefended left. The result was slaughter. The Union forces fell back in disarray. In this second battle of Bull Run, the defeat as fully humiliating as the first one had been. Pope's forces retreated east, back towards Washington. To make matters even more controversial, on August 27th and 28th, McClellan's 2 corps of the Armies of the Potomac were at Alexandria. It could have come to aid Pope. Halleck had actually ordered him to link up with Pope's forces. However, McClellan refused to move. He used weak excuses that his corps weren't quite fully prepared to move out. Lincoln and his staff were infuriated by McClellan's refusal to come to Pope's aid. Some even wanted him court-martialed. The problem, though, is that the Army still loved McClellan, and their loyalty could be mutiny if McClellan was dismissed. Lincoln desperately needed to keep his army together in case they had to respond to an invasion of Maryland by Lee. That desperation by Lincoln, his army's morale from completely collapsing, led to on September 2nd, Lincoln to put McClellan in command of the merged Union armies in the field. McClellan got his promotion. At this point in the summer of 1862, the eastern sector wasn't the only sector where Union forces were facing reversals. In both the central and western sectors, the Confederates won big. In the western sector, late in the month of June, 2 Union forces were converging on Vicksburg. Vicksburg was an incredibly tough defensive fixture, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the West by the Confederates. The city was situated on a 200-foot bluff and could only be attacked by land from the east. For several weeks in July, Federal Navy's 3 guns and 23 mortars pounded Vicksburg. but they took heavy fire in return. This big gun duel proved to be a standoff. Northern soldiers then tried to dig a bypass canal out to flank the city. Because of disease and sickness from the pushing the Union ranks. Farragut then began to fear that his deep draft ocean-going vessels could be trapped by the falling river water. He prepared to pull out. New Union fleets giving up on taking Vicksburg for the year was seen as a victory by the Southern people. Had stood strong in the face of a enemy attack and did not wilt. Union forces in Tennessee and northern Mississippi experienced even greater embarrassment. After the capture of Corinth on May 30th and Memphis on June 6th, the Federal Army had to divert sizable amounts of combat units to occupation in the 40,000 or more square miles they had just conquered. Declining river levels this unusually dry summer made them dependent on railroads for supply. They had to divert even more troops to protect the rails and bridges from frequent guerrilla cavalry attacks. When Halleck went to Washington to become General-in-Chief in July, Grant command of these occupation forces. While in command, he would face an offensive by the Confederates to retake Corinth. That attack part of a two-pronged Confederate counteroffensive in the West, the primary goal of which was to strike the heart of Kentucky in the hopes of convincing the people of that state to join the Confederacy. This plan was devised by Braxton Bragg, who took over command of the Western Department on July 27, 1862. He took over from Beauregard after the evacuation of Corinth. At first, after Corinth, it seemed like the Union forces, not the Confederate ones, would be going on the offensive. Like I mentioned earlier, taking the Confederate rail center of Chattanooga in Tennessee would break the Confederacy path. To accomplish that, Halleck ordered 40,000 men from Buell's Army of Ohio to move against the rail center. Buell's advance would go miserably. Rebel guerrillas attacked its supply lines to regularly harass the Army of Ohio, which significantly slowed their movement. 3 weeks after leaving Corinth, Buell had only advanced 90 miles, less than halfway to Chattanooga. By July 8th, we're approaching Seaton, Alabama, which had a rail line connected to Nashville. They used that line to supply their advance. However, just as the first train of supplies was heading south from Nashville on July 13th, the famous Confederate cavalryman Nathan Bedford Forrest and his men captured the Union garrison at Murfreesboro, breaking the railroad at this juncture. Forrest would go on to destroy 3 more bridges just south of Nashville. Actions like that of Forrest caused massive damage to Buell's advance. Finally, the Army of Ohio crossed the Tennessee River 20 miles from Chattanooga. However, once again, more Confederate cavalry raids continued to hurt their ability to connect to rail lines. Buell's advance showed how fragile Union supply lines could be when operating in the interior of the South. This is when Bragg was able to create an opportunity for a two-pronged counterattack. Bragg left 32,000 men under Van Dorn and Price to defend Vicksburg. And then, once the opportunity presented itself, to launch a strike at the Union garrison at Corinth. Meanwhile, he took the remaining 34,000 men of his army to Chattanooga, to then launch an invasion of Kentucky. Bragg was also aided by Edmund Kirby Smith's 18,000 men in eastern Tennessee. Bragg was able to transfer his 34,000 men from Mississippi to Chattanooga in a roundabout rail route. Once the two Confederate forces were united in Tennessee in mid-August, they would strike north into the heart of Kentucky, forcing Buell to pivot north as well to meet this threat. This was Knoxville on August 14th. In 2 weeks, reached Richmond, Kentucky, only 75 miles from Nashville. They continued on after defeating the Union force at Richmond, then occupied Lexington, preparing to inaugurate Confederate governor of the nearby capital of Frankfort. Bragg's 30,000, he had actually transferred some 3,000 men to him. Meanwhile, meanwhile had marched to Chattanooga on a parallel route about 100 miles west of the pit. By September, Bragg had reached Huntersville, about only 60 miles from Louisville. Seeing the Confederate threat, the Union Army gathered a force of 60,000 new recruits at Cincinnati. As well, only 50,000 men of the Army of Ohio pivoted north from Stevenston. By September, they were as far north as Louisville. September 18th, the Confederates had armies in Kentucky, and another force poised to strike at the Union garrison or the key rail center of the work. These two Confederate moves keep up their momentum that are Maryland. Very possibly in the war, Confederates. Okay, let's shift back to the Eastern section. After the victory at Second Manassas, victorious, although exhausted army could have wanted to preempt the threat. He gave almost no thought to that. He had the initiative then, and he wasn't going to give that up and let the Union Army regroup itself. He had strong reasons for wanting to embark on an offensive in Maryland. One thing, the Union Army was weak and demoralized after the setback. The Confederates let up now. The Union Army would prevent themselves to launch another invasion in the future. Another reason was supplies. So far in the East that all of the major fighting had been in Virginia. The farmland of Virginia had been exhausted, according to the Confederate Army, and by going into Maryland, for his army, the rich, unspoiled countryside there. Another reasoning was the state of Maryland itself. Maryland was places where these felt their population rise up and aid their advance. Maybe even add some troops to the Confederate Army. As well as more political on that in Maryland. This election was when the fall of 1860. These armies could throw east to the north. The war from a public opinion perspective would take a turn. And the northern coastal East Democrats, or Copperheads as they were known, the U.S. Congress. Those East Democrats would then push for an armistice, then be a victory for the South. These rises to Maryland could also be from support by the way of Great Britain and France, recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation state. From there, those two powers could intervene to break apart the Union blockade and push the Union to armistice. However, I will cover this aspect more thoroughly in the World of Union section of this video. The final and most important reason he wanted to drive north was his nature. He was an attacking and aggressive general. Means that any long war would be a disaster for the South. North just had too much manpower and industrial might. The South continued to stay on the defensive indefinitely, holding off all of these Union foes. These mines, the only way the South could win the war would be by keeping the war into the north and winning a decisive victory over the Army of the Potomac there. Such a victory would make the war seem unwinnable in the north. That in turn could cause international intervention by Great Britain or France, or by the northern people voting for peace Democrats to push for an armistice. On September 2nd and 3rd, Lee's army struck north. The Army of Northern Virginia would enter Maryland on September 4th, 1862, when they crossed the Potomac River at White's Ford. By September 9th, they would reach as far north as Frederick. However, they did not receive the warm welcome they had expected. Family farms and towns of western Maryland had very few slaves, resembling the dynamic of the smaller Pennsylvania farms, more than they did the large plantations south. The Southern soldiers didn't exactly inspire confidence either. Without shoes and wearing tattered rags for uniforms, they looked more like an army of beggars than soldiers, and they smelled awful. It was said you could smell this Confederate army before you could see them. As Lee's army advanced, it steadily declined due to an unprecedented number of stragglers. The invasion had started with 55,000 men, but in a week to 10 days, at least 10,000 all over miles of Virginia and Maryland countryside. After reaching Frederick, he had a monumental decision to make, one that would decide the fate of his invasion. His advance into Maryland had cut off and isolated the Harper's Ferry Union garrison from Washington and the Army of the Potomac. He expected the 10,500 Union troops there and the 2,500 at Martinsburg to evacuate their posts. That was something McClellan had requested of Halleck. McClellan believed the invading army to be 120,000 strong, roughly double the size it actually was. So he wanted all the reinforcements he could get a hold of. Halleck denied this request. Those garrisons controlled access to the Shenandoah Valley. Those two garrisons were ordered to hold out to the last extremity. This was a problem and an opportunity for Lee. These forces would be in supply lines for the Shenandoah Valley. At the same time, the Union base at Harper's Ferry was a rich and tempting prize. The Union supply depot there had food, shoes, clothing, and weapons, all of which the Army of Northern Virginia desperately needed. On September 9th, Lee decided it was worth the risk and divided his army into 4 parts. The largest part would be under Jackson, and it was to recross the Potomac and circle around to the west of Harper's Ferry in order to attack it from that direction. The next 2 parts were under the command of Generals Lafayette McLaws and John Walker. They were to capture the Maryland, Loudon Heights, commanded the eastern and southern approaches to Harper's Ferry. These movements would effectively surround Harper's Ferry. The final portion of Lee's army would stay near Hagerstown and cover the gaps through the South Mountain Range, protecting the eastern approach to the area. These 2 points in the South Mountains, as you can see from the map, were the 2 gaps in the mountain range that the Confederates needed to hold while the Harper's Ferry forces took the town. The Union army, going to attack the dispersed rebels, would be through these 2 passes that they would have to cross. By dividing his forces in this way, they ran the risk that McClellan might burst through the gaps in the South Mountains and destroy Lee's army in detail, or one at a time while they were all weakly separated. Lee felt comfortable with this gamble partly from experience. Twice in the last 3 months, he had divided his army in the face of enemies and had gotten away with it. Those bold decisions had led to great victories. Lee gambled that once again he could pull it off. After all, the army itself was disorganized and demoralized after their defeat. In no shape to quickly pursue his Maryland invasion. On September 10th, Lee's army split up and departed Frederick on their various missions. The Army of the Potomac, the strength of roughly 80 to 85,000 men, which had the capability of ruining Lee's plans, departed from the Washington, D.C. area on September 7th. In a surprising turn, the Union Army's morale had quickly rebounded after 2nd Manassas. That was in no small part due to McClellan taking back full command. Say what you will about McClellan as a general in the field, he definitely had the love and loyalty of his men. The Army of the Potomac would receive a particularly warm welcome in the town of Frederick when they arrived there on September 13th. This town had hated the Confederates' rough approach through the area and saw the Union Army as liberators on their way to destroy the invading rebel horde. Another huge boost in morale for the Union Army came in the spirit of defense. For the first time in the war, they were defending their home territory rather than invading a foreign land. It was finally their turn to fight for their home's very survival. While in Frederick, one of the most incredible moments of the Civil War occurred. In a farm field just outside of the town, a corporal in the 27th Indiana found a sheet of paper wrapped around 3 cigars. On that paper were Lee's exact orders for his army. The plans then made their way to McClellan. Now possessed one of the greatest advantages ever gifted upon a general. McClellan knew exactly where Lee's armies were, and if he moved with conviction, he could be decisively defeated before they united. McClellan was determined not to react too rashly. He wanted to carefully plan out his next move. Part of that was because he had 40,000 more troops than he actually possessed. The actual troop strength comparison is roughly 85,000 to 55,000 in favor of the Federals. 6 hours passed before McClellan ultimately issued his first orders to commanders who were to march to the South Mountain Gap and attack the divided enemy. Obviously, they were going to march immediately though, right? Nope. The next morning of September 14th would do. McClellan had Lee's army separated into 4 groups that were too distant to mutually support each other. Yet, he still couldn't overcome his own natural caution. The first Union units did not move out until 18 hours after McClellan had seen Lee's orders. That was all the margin Lee needed to avoid disaster. September 14th would be an eventful day. Union garrison at Martinsburg had retreated to Harper's Ferry to bring their combined strength up to 13,000. They were followed closely by Jackson's 2 divisions. Harper's Ferry, located at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, and virtually surrounded by high hills. Into defending or taking the town, he could gain control of the Loudon and Maryland Heights to the east of the town. The Union commander, Colonel Dixon Miles, failed miserably. The Loudon Heights had sent no troops to defend, and the Maryland Heights had only sent 1,600. Both of these key strategic locations were quickly taken by the Confederates on September 12th and 13th. By September 14th, Jackson was tightening the noose around Harper's Ferry, while Confederate artillery, using the high ground, blasted away at the helpless garrison. Harper's Ferry would officially fall on September 15th. This was incredibly welcome news for Lee, as September 14th was a rough day for him. If McClellan had moved more quickly on September 13th, he could have caught Lee by even more surprise. However, on the night of the 13th, Lee had been given warning the Union Army knew his plan. It was coming to breach the South Mountain Gap. Lee tried desperately to hold these mountain passes. He rushed troops to the sector, but the defenders of the 2 passes were still badly outnumbered. After fierce battling, Union forces pushed through the Crampton and Turner Gap. On the night of September 14th and 15th, the Confederate situation looked dire. In the fighting to hold these passes, rebels had lost casualties amounting to almost a quarter of the men who were not besieging Harper's Ferry. Lee knew that the next day, the rest of the Union armies would pour through the mountain gaps. The leader of the Army of Northern Virginia was devastated on this night, as it appeared as though his invasion of Maryland was a failure. Retreating back to Virginia after the South Mountain battle would secure it as a massive defeat for the Confederacy. In turn, the Confederacy's best hope to win the war, and lose all possibility of foreign intervention. Lee's retreat also most likely caused the Kentucky invasion to collapse as well, so it's pretty much looking all bad for the rebels at this moment. Mood would change dramatically at sunrise on September 15th, when Lee received the good news that Harper's Ferry had fallen. The invasion of Maryland was now shockingly continued. Lee could challenge McClellan in the decisive war-winning battle that he had hoped for when he had pushed the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland. The courier that delivered the news of the fall of Harper's Ferry had reached Lee when his army was near Sharpsburg, where a line of ridges meant for a rural landscape with pastures, crop fields, and woodlots. The town was roughly 3 miles north of the Potomac, and just west of a creek named Antietam, which is how the battle got its name in the north. This meant the position would await the oncoming Federal Army. Lee's army would have both of its flanks anchored on water. It had one disadvantage, though. Only route of retreat over the Potomac River 3 miles to their rear. Lee stated, "We will make our stand on these hills." From there, he sent word to his scattered units to march to Sharpsburg as fast as possible. However, until these units arrived, they would have used 18,000 men to face the Army of the Potomac. On the afternoon of September 15th, McClellan's army arrived on the east side of Antietam Creek. Surprisingly, they didn't launch any probing attacks, didn't send any cavalry recon to cross the two undefended bridges or the several fords. If they had, McClellan could have learned that he had a massive advantage in manpower. By the 16th, McClellan had 55,000 troops on hand, with another 14,000 within 6 miles. Lee's army, on the other hand, had not gathered more than 25,000 at that point. McClellan had missed his chance to crush Lee's army while they were separated on the 14th. He had also missed a chance to attack the heavily outnumbered Confederate army on the 15th. Next, he would miss another opportunity on the 16th. McClellan spent much of the 16th planning out his attack for September 17th. On the 17th, he would finally be able to cobble together 36,000 men for the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg as the South called it. At dawn on September 17th, 1862, 55,000 men of the Army of the Potomac under General McClellan face off against Lee's 36,000 men of the Army of Northern Virginia to decide the fate of the war. When talking about the Battle of Antietam, you must bring up the index on the scope of the war by way of the slavery question. For starters, the American war did not, in fact, start out as a war on slavery. That doesn't mean that the Civil War was not primarily caused by slavery. Slavery and the question of expansion, primary cause of tension between North and South throughout the 1800s. That tension threw a wedge between the two sides. Events like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott decision, the Lecompton Constitution, and Bleeding Kansas all centered around the slavery question. And each one of those events caused bitter debates and even bloodshed. The tension would eventually explode into open hostilities after Lincoln's election victory in 1860, and then the ensuing Battle of Fort Sumter. That way, slavery was never far from the Civil War. However, at the start of the conflict, Lincoln was not attempting a war on slavery. It was at first a war purely to unite the Union. Most students of Lincoln will know this famous quote: "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Further the goal of uniting the Union, Lincoln looked to provide as little pressure or friction as possible on the Southern troops to bring them back under the Union. He was not looking for a total or unlimited war to subjugate the South. So that kind of war just between animosity between North and South. It could never be neutral or fair. As well, the Northern public would not support a war to end slavery. A war on slavery is not something they were willing to send to fight and die. However, a war to restore the Union is much more palatable and even energizing to the Northern public. They quickly got behind a war to restore the Union. In a way, a war to end slavery just wouldn't have resonated in 1861 America. Another key reason he could not even consider a war on slavery at the start was the border states stayed in the Union. A war against slavery from the start would have immediately led to Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland joining the Confederacy. And all three of those were slave states who would not join the war on slavery. Real politics, or practical politics, had to be considered by the Lincoln administration. Finally, maybe most important, at the start of the war, he felt he had no constitutional authority to emancipate anyone in place. Maybe tried to attempt to appeal to the Supreme Court. At this time, Annie was still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Annie was the man who led the Dred Scott decision. economy built around the trade of cash crops like cotton. Before the war, slavery made the cotton so that it could be exported or the back to another underrated aspect of slavery in relation to military affairs. In order for the Confederacy to maintain its army in the field, slave labor handled farming and manual labor tasks back at the farm and plantation. How that slave labor, the Confederate Army south its war supplies, mostly on the vine, as well as militaries in the actual battlefield areas like on slaves or the thousands of slaves that army laborers, urban, other support capacities. It provided much of the detail of the Confederate Army. That's the interesting element of the Civil War. The Union Army had to rely on soldiers to do those jobs as well as fight in the field, while the Confederate soldiers, because of slave labor, primarily focused on fighting. That is why the raw Union number advantages in battles isn't always as pronounced as it would seem. The Confederates did not count slave numbers in their field army. As the war became more ferocious, more of the military greed came up. After all, without slavery, the Confederacy had no chance of putting their army into the field. They didn't have the manpower to work on the farm and build up large armies. That is why more and more voices in the North amplified the idea of attacking slavery as a military necessity. It felt needed. Union forces were engaged in a bitter struggle. Some war approach that seemed reasonable at the start of the war was no longer compatible with the war they were now embroiled in. More Republicans had been warming up to the idea of a harder war approach after the first year of the conflict. Southern states, in their minds, had started the war. So why should they continue to fight a war in a way that avoided touching the South's main institution, slavery? The South had given up that right and didn't respect the pact of independence. It just continued to not make sense, to not hurt the Confederacy's primary need in their war effort. Additionally, emancipation did not only hurt the South's ability to fight the war, but also an asset to the North's ability to fight the war. Union forces could confiscate slaves as enemy property, free them, and put them to work for the Union. That used soldiers from logistic duties to then go out and fight in the battlefield. If the North declared that all slaves in the South were completely free, this could cause a rush of slaves to try and escape the South and join the Union line, which in turn could cripple the Confederacy, provide a massive boost to the Union Army. Slaves had actually entered this debate on their own volition, as many of them saw the war as a potential path to freedom. They would escape their masters to enter Union camp. Union officers have to decide between turning them to slavery or acknowledging their freedom. This is where the term contraband of war comes from. Union commander and Fortress Monroe, Benjamin Butler, used to return Virginia slaves by labeling them contraband of war. Not all Union soldiers felt this way, though. Many were fighting for a war to serve the Union, and were anything but abolitionists. However, as the war dragged on, more and more started to feel that in order to win the war, they must take the gloves off and attack all elements of Confederate society. Taking the gloves off is exactly where Lincoln's mind went over the course of 1860. He stated, "This government cannot much longer play a game which it stakes all in its enemies nothing. Those enemies must understand they cannot exist 10 years trying to destroy the government, and if they fail, they'll come back into the Union unhurt." Basically, for Lincoln, the war had to become absolute to continue to pull punches against the South. And furthermore, he needed to press